Today we are interviewing Carolyn P Ahearn, who held the position of Director of Library Services for the Washington, D.C. firm of Shaw, Pittman, Potts, and Trowbridge from 1979 until 1996. She then moved on to be Director of Library Services for Wiley Rain Limited Liability Partnership until retiring in May 2010. In October of 2010, however, Carolyn temporarily came out of retirement to become the Interim Associate Dean for Information Systems and Director of the Law Library at Hofstra University, a position she held until September of 2011. Now fully retired as a law librarian, Carolyn is not fully retired from other things because she is currently a member of the board of the Adirondack Folk School in Lake Lucerne, New York, where she resides. Carolyn, you and I go back a long way. And I think that's a positive thing. We were both in D.C. as librarians and really got to know each other in the various activities of the Law Librarian Society of Washington, D.C. And I remember one of the characteristics of that group that was really something I was very pleased with was it brought together librarians from the various types of law libraries. You know, we go out into the world, at least among our colleagues in those days, and the law firm librarians were sort of one group, the academics were another, the academic directors a third, then you had the state court and county group, and what the society seemed to do, and those of us in it, I think, found this very much to the good in our liking, was that we brought all these groups together. And the government librarians, because we had a lot of those in D.C. as well. And we learned to work together, and I think we learned a lot from that. Maybe we can talk about that in a few minutes.
Okay, because I definitely agree with you.
Oh, thank you. But let's start with a little of your personal history. Could you tell us a little bit about what life was like when you were young, and then perhaps more recently and today?
I grew up in a small town in upstate New York, actually out in the country. And, you know, it was a pretty normal childhood in many ways. But I remember, I think because my mother had traveled, my mother was a first-generation immigrant, and she would talk about the old country and talk about when she traveled back several times when she was a child. And that sort of gave me the idea that there was more to the world than my little town of Scotia, New York. And that was sort of always in the back of my mind that there was more to it. And I had the luck of my grandparents had bought a very small piece of property in upstate New York on a lake, and I spent every summer there. And it was a summer community of what we're, in the Adirondacks we call camps, which are summer homes. And the people that comprised the community were primarily school teachers from New York City. And there were actually even several school librarians in the mix. So those people, certainly much more than my school experience and my family experience, sort of opened my mind again to the world. They talked about politics, and they were very socially active. This was back in the days of the Freedom Riders, and some of the people had actually gone and worked with the Freedom Riders down in the South, and very liberal, and with an emphasis on education. I think that sort of got me on the track of being interested in that kind of thing. And I worked there as a child. I worked, I was 16, I guess. I started working as a lifeguard on the lake of this small community. And people would come by and recommend books for me to read because it was pretty boring. And so they brought all the classics to me, and then I would sit and talk about it. So that sort of fostered my love of reading. And so that was sort of the beginning for me of this interest in librarianship kinds of things. And I will tell you, this just dawned on me today when I was thinking about this. The house that I grew up in had a little closet. In my bedroom, I had a little closet. I think it was originally designed as a shoe closet, but it was very small. And when I was a kid, I used to play librarian. I don't think I've ever told anybody this before, but I got from Woolworths, I got a little checkout stamp with the date on it, and I used to put little things in my books, and I liked the activity of checking the book out or stamping it and moving it from one pile to another, which now sounds ridiculous, but there must have been something early on in my life that you know, created this affinity for books and that kind of thing. So that was really my foundation and how I sort of got, you know, how I grew up and probably laid the groundwork for where I ended up. On the other end of all of that, I did retire permanently 2 years ago, and I'm very happy. I'm actually loving it. I wasn't sure at first what that was going to be like. I didn't have any master plan, but I knew I had a lot of interest that had sort of been pushed aside when I was working and raising a family and doing the professional things. And so once I settled back, my husband and I rebuilt our camp in the Adirondacks into a permanent year-round home, and I moved up there, and just lucky to bump into different groups of people and that had similar interests, and so I'm involved in lots of different things up there, and probably as busy as I was when I was working, which is what I like. So, and one of the things I've spoken to people with here, I've been at the conference for a couple of days now, and I went to a number of programs, and they're going like, why do you bother going to programs? You know, you don't have a library. And I realized that so many of the skills that I learned here through AALL and through my working career are skills that are transferable to what I'm doing now. I'm on the board of the folk school, and I know how to run a meeting, which a lot of the folks involved in this haven't had the opportunity to run meetings. I know how to do that because I learned it here. They don't know a lot about technology, and I'm not a technology guru, but I understand enough of it to know how to get started on some of the projects they need to undertake. So the kinds of things that I learned and used in my career and in my professional activities transfer perfectly into retired life, and I really like that.
Well, you know, one of the concerns that I know I had in anticipating retirement, and I think everybody does, is what are you going to do with your time? And surprisingly, that seems to take care of itself rather well.
It does if you work at it, Pat.
Well,
you have
you
to
do.
agree to that.
Yes.
You know, there are some people that retire and say, well, I don't know what to do. I get up, I have a cup of coffee, I sit there, read the paper, and then I don't know what to do for the rest of the day. So for them, it doesn't take care of itself. But I think if you're interested in different things and you're willing to go out and find whatever your passion is, your time will fly by.
Yeah. Well, I know that many of my retired friends and colleagues, including now I know for sure about you, have found things to do which are not only to fill the time, but there's a lot of enjoyment from them, and you meet people in the community.
Yes, it's the same networking and kinds of things of just, you know, getting to know people. And I think that one of the reasons that I enjoyed my career so much in my activities was that I really do like people. I'm incredibly shy, but I like people, and I like helping people. And so the folk school is relatively new. Getting that off the ground has been, you know, a real challenge, and I enjoy that. And the other thing I'm very much involved in is I volunteer at something that's called the Double H Ranch, which is a Paul Newman Hole in the Woods camp for critically ill children. And in the summer, they bring in kids for a typical summer camp program for kids that couldn't go to a regular summer camp because of all of their health issues. And I'm involved with helping them go horseback riding and taking kids that are wheelchair bound, maybe very spastic with certain medical conditions, and actually showing them that they can get up on a horse. We have adaptive equipment, get them up on a horse and take them out into the woods. And it's an experience they thought they would never have, and it is just thrilling to see the kids do that.
That must create wonderful memories for those kids through the rest of their lives, be it long or short.
Yes, exactly. And in the wintertime, I've been trained to be an adaptive ski instructor. And we do the same things. The kids that we deal with in the wintertime, many of them are not as severely disabled, obviously because of the physical limitations, but there's so much adaptive equipment out there now that you can take a child, again, with maybe a wheelchair-bound kid and put them in a bucket on a monoski and give them some outriggers if they have muscle capacity, and we can get them down a very gentle slope skiing. And for most of these kids, it's the first time they've ever been, quote unquote, on their own, feeling that they're on their own, and gathering any speed and going, you know, fast. And it is amazing to watch these kids. And, you know, you say that the kids get a lot out of it, and they do. Sort of one of my personal goals is to work with the kids and to give them these experiences so that they can go home with their siblings and say, well, you know, you went skiing, so did I can ski. Or you climbed a rock wall, or you rode a horse, I did that too at camp. But I get so much more out of it, I think, than even the kids do. Just watching their faces and watching the satisfaction and the achievement that they get from doing it is just unbelievable.
Well, this certainly does sound like you're having a wonderful time doing it, and it's very useful and very helpful to the people around you,
yeah,
especially these participating kids.
It's great for the kids, it's great for the parents, because again, you know, many of us have been parents, and you just, you know, you want your kids to have all the experiences, and some of these parents just, you know, have not been able to see their child do that, and to see the parents' relief that they can, first of all, have a little time away from their child, just watch them as opposed to being involved in their care, and then seeing them accomplish something is just wonderful. So.
A few moments ago, Carolyn, you mentioned that you've been going to programs, and let me sort of clarify a little bit for our viewers who might think of those of us who are retired as, you know, suddenly we're no longer ever at meetings. We're actually here in Seattle, Washington today, and have been for a couple of days, and the meeting continues tomorrow at the annual meeting of the AALL. And the reason this is important from my perspective is that you have been somebody, obviously, who's done a great deal for the association, for the profession, and so on, and somebody of exactly the type we wanted to be able to chat with for our oral history project. And the question is, you're living in New York State, and I happened to be living out here in Washington State, and how do we all get together to do this? And then suddenly, I found out that you were going to be given the association's highest honor, which I truly think is wonderful and well-deserved.
Thank you.
And that's the Marion Gould Gallagher Distinguished Service Award, and you're receiving it formally tomorrow at the association luncheon. You will also be inducted into the AALL's Hall of Fame. That means if you come to another meeting, you get a little ribbon that identifies you as such, and you can wear it around. And some of the newer members are, you know, they know there's somebody they can talk to, and because you've obviously done all the right things, including talk to our newer colleagues over the years and mentored them and all that sort of thing. Well, let's talk a little bit of how that all came about. One does not start out being a law librarian. One usually has to acquire a certain amount of professional training and education, formal education. Could you talk a little bit about what you did, what your degrees, and where you got them?
Okay. When I was in high school, I don't really know why, but I wanted to go to an all-women's school. It was fairly serious, and I just thought that I would be more dedicated to my studies if I went to an all-women's school. And so I ended up going to Chatham College in Pittsburgh, which was a very small all-women's college, and it's still one of the few schools that's still all-female. And I really enjoyed that experience. The classes were very small, and very good friendships with people. It was just, I thought it was wonderful. But I did, after my second year, feel a little bit stifled. Plus, Pittsburgh was a long way from my home, and I sort of felt the call to go home. And there was, I grew up near Schenectady, New York, and there was a very old all-men's school there called Union College that was just going co-ed. And so I applied, and I was accepted in the first class of graduating women. So I essentially went from an all-women's school to an all-men's school, which is an experience most people don't get to have. And that move turned out to be a really good one because it just gave me a different perspective. It was a larger school. It gave me a different perspective on education and discussion and sharing. Because I found in the women's school, and women will probably hate me for this, but I found quite often that many of the women sort of just took in all the knowledge that was being given to us and probably had their own creative thoughts, but were less forthcoming with sharing those kinds of things. They really just took it in, thought about it, wrote it down, and you know, responded on the exams, but didn't do a lot. And when I went to school with men, I found there was a lot more talking and interchange with each other and with the professors. Maybe they hadn't read the homework assignment and they just wanted to talk to keep the professor from figuring out they hadn't read it, but there was a lot more exchange and dialogue in the classrooms I found to be more active, and I really enjoyed that. I liked the contrast between the two, and so I thought that was a useful experience for me. So while I was at Union, I met my husband. He was a year ahead of me. And he was going to go for a 2-year master's program down in Washington, D.C. And so when I was getting ready to graduate, I looked around and was trying to figure out what it was I wanted to do. I'd had a number of majors in college, including anthropology and theater. And then, but I'd always been very interested in Spanish. I'd taken Spanish all through high school and into college and just enjoyed it, so I did it. And that gave me the opportunity to travel throughout college, doing some volunteer work in Latin America and you know, the traditional summer abroad program in Spain. And so but I didn't know what I wanted to do. I knew I didn't want to. So I know I was studying in Spain. In my senior year, we were on the trimester, and I was studying in Spain, and I was an anthro major at that point, and I got a email or a letter from my professor saying, you know, you have to do a dissertation in order to graduate. And I didn't want to really do a dissertation. I was having a good time in Spain. I didn't really want to have to settle down, so I said, well, I'll just change my major. I had enough credits to graduate in Spanish, so I graduated as a Spanish major, but didn't want to teach and didn't really know what I wanted to do. So from my summer community, sort of, you know, the idea of librarianship was on the, you know, I knew about it at least. It wasn't something that I felt I wanted to do, but I knew about it. But I decided to go and talk to my college librarian, or one of the librarians that I had befriended in college, and her name was Ruth Ann Evans, and I went up to her one day and said, you know, I'm thinking about possibly going to library school. I like the idea, plus I'm looking for a 1-year graduate degree that will make me something, and I will be a librarian. And she said, oh, librarianship is a wonderful career, you'll love it. And she said, but you do have to be prepared, because there are days when all hell could break loose. And at the time, I just chuckled about that, thinking, come on, all hell breaking loose in the library? I don't think so. And so many times when all hell was breaking loose in my library, in my life, I would think back to Ruth Ann and say, oh, you were so right. So I did go ahead, and I was accepted to Catholic University, and I got my library degree from there. And by that time I was married, and my husband was going to go on to the University of Pennsylvania for more graduate work. And so I went with him to Philadelphia, and I was right out of library school. Philadelphia has its own library school, and they were pushing their own graduates to most of the libraries, so I really could not find a way to get my foot in the door as a librarian. So I ended up taking a job at Penn for an economics professor who had a grant from the National Science Foundation. And I liked the title, it was research bibliographer. So I basically was his secretary for a while, and I got to be friendly with another woman similarly situated. She didn't have a graduate degree, but a college grad who was working as a secretary while her husband was in law school. Her husband had a summer associate position at one of the firms in Philly, and he told me one of the reasons they hired him was because he had worked in a library before, and they needed somebody to sort of straighten out his library, their library rather. So in addition to doing summer associate work, he also was in charge of the library. And when he left, they didn't want the library to fall back into disrepair. And so he said, well, I know somebody who might want to work there. So he asked me if I wanted to, and I said, I don't know anything about law libraries. I had never taken any law library classes. I had intended to be a college and university librarian. And so I said, sure, I'll go ahead and give it a try. So I went to the firm and interviewed, and they hired me, and with the idea that I would work their evenings and weekends. So I was very excited about it, but pretty nervous too, because as I said, I had no idea. I didn't know anything about law, the law firms, or I just had never had any exposure to that. I went the first evening that I was supposed to be there, met with the partner who showed me around, took me into the library, and the first book, he left me there, and the first book that I pulled off the shelf, probably because I like red, and the older listeners will know what I'm talking about. There were these red books that were Shepherd citations. So I pulled this book off the shelf, opened it up, and there were just columns of numbers. There was no text, just columns of numbers. And I'm thinking, whoa, what have I gotten myself into? But I worked with my friend's husband. He helped me, and I just went in there and started looking around and figuring it out. So it was sort of really on-the-job training, learning the collection, what it was. I mean, I didn't even know the hierarchy of courts and things. I didn't remember much from civics, I'm afraid. But I really just was interested and desperate, and so I learned it and did it. But that same night, the first night I was there, after I pulled the Shepherds off the shelf, I was doing other things. I found the loose leaves and tried to figure out what was involved with that. And it was like, I don't know, 10:30, 11 o'clock when I finished. And I went to go out the same way I had come in, and the door was locked. They had just a suite of offices on a larger floor, and the door that I had come in was locked. And I thought, oh my God, I'm locked in here. So I called my husband and said, honey, I'm going to stay here overnight. I don't want to bother anybody. I'll just stay here and leave when somebody comes in the morning. He said, no, you will not. Call the guy who hired you and make him come and let you out. So I had to do that. But I like to always say that I was sort of locked into law librarianship after that. So that was my first law firm job, and in addition to working at Penn. And then we moved back to Washington, and at least I had some experience. I could say that I had some experience with law. And I was initially hired as the assistant librarian at Arendt, Fox, Kintner, Plotkin, and Kahn in Washington. And I worked with Austin Doherty, and they were renovating the library at that point in time, so I started out in his rather small office, sitting next to him working off a typing table. But Austin was a great teacher and really helped me get my professional feet under me. And actually, when the time was right, he encouraged me to take another job. I moved to a very small communications firm called Pearson Ball & Dowd, and worked there for several years, and then moved on to the larger firm of Shaw Pittman, where I was for, I guess, 17 years, and then on to Wiley Ryan, where I worked for 13 years. So, and then after that, as you mentioned before, I had the incredible opportunity of going to Hofstra Law and seeing what it was like on the other side, and I think we'll probably talk a little bit more about that later.
Maybe so. Over the years, I mean, those of us in the DC area really got to know you when you were at Shaw Pittman. I mean,
Yeah.
That was sort of your place, and I can remember fondly coming down there, and we'd do lunch. And Cammie King Hedges, who was at the time with B&A, which were literally about 2 blocks away,
Right.
I think, and the three of us would go out and have lunch and talk, and those were very good memories for me. I enjoyed those days and those opportunities immensely. But you actually did a great deal at the firms, and let's talk a little bit about Shaw Pittman, because that's sort of maybe not the totality of your career, but it's where some of us old friends sort of see you even today as representative of that experience. Could you talk a little bit about that experience, maybe some of the things that you accomplished, and particularly I want to begin to anticipate in a few minutes, we'll talk about some of the things you did professionally, but for a law firm librarian to be able to get involved in the broader profession as much as you were able to do so and take on the leadership roles and so on, it always occurred to me that the partners at that firm must have been very, very supportive of this. But could you talk a little bit about that whole opportunities that occurred during that period?
I want to step back just a little bit and say when I was at Arendt Fox with Austin Doherty, I believe it was one of the years that AAI was actually in Washington, D.C., and Austin was involved either with the LSDC or with National, I don't remember, in terms of planning. And so one of my tasks was to do some of the work that he had volunteered to do and, you know, become involved. And so it was just a given at that point that that was what you did, in addition to learning about legislation or distributing publications, you know, putting reading lists on publications. You were involved in the profession. That's just the message I took from Austin. And then when I went over to Shaw Pittman, as you well know, I had been preceded there by someone who had worked for you for many years, Joanne Zeke.
That's correct.
And she was the first librarian, I believe, at Shaw Pittman, and she laid the groundwork for everyone who came behind her, because she taught them how to understand and appreciate what a law librarian can do in a private firm. And so having Joanne, having laid that groundwork, was very useful to me. The other thing was that I was very insecure. Again, I had not been, you know, I was a shy, sort of a shy person, although no one can believe that. I truly am fundamentally very shy. I loved my job, I wanted a job, I needed the money, and so I wanted to make sure that I did everything right. And I wanted to be the best at it that I could. And because I didn't know very much, the one thing I did know is that there were people out there who knew more than I did, and I wanted to know them. And so that was why it was important to me to get out to meet people initially, was because I just wanted them to help me keep my job. And you remember what it was like in DC. We had no lending bar library. That's
right.
A little something we should set up, I think. There was no lending bar library in DC. And the other historical fact was that just when I started out in the mid to late 70s, private firm librarians were a new phenomenon. They were just coming into being, really. The large firms, the New York City firms, and I'm sure maybe Chicago and San Francisco had them, but most of the other smaller firms that were popping up really didn't have law librarians. And so many of us were the first in our positions. As I said, I had Joanne to follow, but she certainly was the first. And I think blazing that ground and sort of trying to figure out what we could do and how we could help the firms grow and prosper was something that you know, was important to all of us that were doing that. And again, collegiality was the ticket to that. One of the things we needed to know, and one of the things that was important to me, was sort of with limited resources, how can I get my attorneys what they need to see? And the interlibrary loan network that we set up in Washington was just terrific. And we did cooperative purchasing among the firms back then when you had to get all the state codes in hard copy. No firm except the largest could afford to keep all of the state codes, and so we agreed among ourselves in the private firm group that we would, you know, each take a code and make it available on interlibrary loan. And that again was a reason to get together with your colleagues and share and collaborate.
I remember being not only hearing about all these arrangements that the firms had made with each other to basically be able to get at this stuff without everyone having to own it, which was not practical, and being so impressed. You know, in those days, the academic sector where I was tended to be sort of, each shop was a place under its own,
right,
with its own collections and so on. But what we were seeing and knowing about you, and the fact that there were resources that none of the local academics could all have, we too developed some of these sharing arrangements. And Georgetown, Bob Oakley was there, and GW, and the other local schools, Catholic and American. And in fact, at one point we all had gotten the same online catalogs, and in those days we didn't have the internet, but we had telephone connections, and you could actually go on and search the catalogs of the other member libraries by telephoning them through the system. It took a while to connect, but it came up, and you could see, you know, other books, or if something was available at Georgetown that we might not have at American or something. Right,
and among the private firms, we didn't have that capability. Certainly we were not all on the same systems. Many of them were not even, you know, LC cataloged, but at least initially. But we did one of the projects that I think brought the DC private librarians together and made us such a strong and cohesive group was the union lists that we did. And we put together a union list of periodicals, union lists of codes, all sorts of things, published them and made them available. And eventually those did become, the list became automated, but for a long time they were just paper lists you went to and you called the librarian or the interlibrary loan specialist and asked if they had it, and if they had it, they would loan it to you. And
another product or a result of some of the work in the firms were it was a legislative history collection on microfilm, as I recall at the time, or microfiche, that the firms had been behind, especially Covington and Burling.
I was going to say, I believe that actually started there, under Jack, and I believe Joanne Zeke actually worked on that for a while. She did some of that work, but we also, as the firms, private librarianship became accepted within firms and we were able to show our value, then the staffs increased and we, many of us were able to get things that the larger firms didn't, larger firms had, which was a legislative history person, and did a lot of work on it. You know, we were in Washington, D.C., that was our bread and butter.
Certainly the attorneys in the firm would find that information extremely helpful.
Very useful, and you know, we developed that expertise in finding the materials, and then we would be tasked to go through it and identify the areas in the Senate report or the final legislation that related to the topic the partner was interested in, because they certainly were not going to read through this large tome of material, and so that was one of the things that the legislative librarians would do.
Yeah. Well, you had a fairly long career at Shaw Pittman, but then you went on to Wiley Rein, or Rain? And Rein, yeah. And you were there actually a fair number of years as well. Could you talk a little bit about perhaps that experience and maybe what you were able to do there?
Yes, I'd be happy to talk about that, but let me go back one step. When I was at Shaw Pittman, that was just, the end of my time at Shaw Pittman was when technology was sort of starting to come along, and Shaw Pittman was very advanced in that regard, and it was difficult because it was a real battle for the librarians to sort of get the attention sometimes of IS. For a long time, private librarians were the only other degreed individuals, certainly on administration in law firms. And then the technology people came in, and as that became more sophisticated, even those of us who had worked with technology, many of us were the ones, I hate to sound like Al Gore, but we brought Lexis and Westlaw into the law firms, and then we did eventually, of course, bring the internet to firms, because a lot of them really hadn't gotten there. Shaw Pittman was ahead of the curve on that, very tech savvy, and understood the value of making use of the technology. When I moved to Wiley Rein, they were not technology oriented. And so I had learned some things from Shaw Pittman that I was able to bring to Wiley Rein, but it was a bit of an uphill battle. And sometimes I got very frustrated by it, but at the same time, as many of us do, said, well, here's a challenge and I'm just going to really work at it. So over time, I had more of a battle at Wiley of bringing in technology, but we got there slowly but surely. But just one of the things that I guess I was most proud about at Wiley was while I was there, we constantly butted up against just not being able, the firm wasn't ready to get an intranet. And this is when most other firms really had developed an intranet. And for a number of reasons, we just didn't have one. And I felt strongly that there was so much information that the attorneys needed. And my biggest passion, I think, in firm librarianship has always been the new associates coming in. I really just felt a kinship for them, probably because I thought they didn't know what they were doing either when they got there, and I, not knowing what I was doing when I first started, I felt a sympathy with them. So we had set up a lot of training programs and things for the new associates, and I thought that there were things that could be done electronically that would make their life much easier. And so I worked with my wonderful staff, and we put together our own wiki, which at the time was wasn't new technology, but for a small individual group within a firm to do it, at least within our firm, was pretty unique. And so we led the way on that. We had a wiki with all of our library information, and we really worked hard to get it something where the associates would talk back to us via the wiki as well. So I know that all sounds very old and outdated now, but at the time that was a pretty new thing. The other thing that I got involved in at Wiley, which I had experience with at Shaw Pittman but hadn't agreed to do at Wiley, was records management. That was something that became more and more sophisticated at firms over time, and I had been asked at Wiley to step in a supervisory position. I didn't know anything about records, but I did know how to manage a department, and so I started off at Shaw Pittman working in the records department and realized at first I said yes because my belief is you always say yes when you're offered something like that. You'd be a fool to turn it down because, you know, it doesn't send the message I want to send. But I realized there was a lot of overlap between records and librarianship. It's organizing information, it's making it accessible, and that resonated with me. So I had experience in records, but when I went to Wiley, they were only looking for a librarian. I took off about 3 or 4 weeks between jobs, and when I showed up, my boss at Wiley said to me, oh, by the way, we see you have records experience, and we've lost our records manager, so we'd like you to do that too. So I went back to having both the records department and the library. And the library was running smoothly. The records department, when I got there, was really a mess. So I spent my first, certainly my first year really concentrating more on records, but doing the library. And then over time, got staff in both areas and got them both nailed down. And then the next thing that the firm was looking for was someone to help with new business intake and conflicts checking. And so I volunteered for that and took that on because, again, the initial conflicts checking is a lot of business searching to make sure that the entity is not related to something else you're representing. And so they were using us to do that information, to seek that information anyhow. So I took that on, and then that developed while I was there into conflicts checking and then new business intake. So I had the opportunity to working with developers from a company, put together a database of all of our clients and had the chance to develop all the fields, which was something, again, I had never done before. I mean, I had used databases certainly, but I'd never been involved in the actual design. And that experience certainly has come invaluable in lots of other ways in my life. Even at the folk school, we were putting together an online registration and working on it, and I'll be in the meetings and I'll say, well, we can't do that because that's going to take the programmer too much time, and we can't afford to pay the programmer that much money, so let's find another way to accomplish this. So just having an understanding of how these things work is valuable in other areas. So those were the kinds of things, and then just a lot of training. I was very emphasized training for everybody. And then lastly, the thing that I've always wanted to do, and I've done this in all of my places that I've worked, I feel people have this maybe not bad, but certainly the bunhead librarian, and you have to be quiet and it's serious, and I've always tried to overcome that. I like to have fun too, and so I reran lots of different programs in the library that might sound a little cheesy, but they seemed to work to break the ice and develop a rapport with the new students, or even some of the older attorneys that had been at the firm for a long time. When there were Olympics, we'd have Olympic book cart races, and we had a Halloween party every year, and we'd come out in costume and give prizes for other people that came in costumes and things like that, just to have fun in the setting too. And that worked well with the staff. They enjoyed that because it sort of put them front and center with the people that they were working with, and gave them a chance to show a little bit of their human side as opposed to just being the interlibrary loan assistant or whatever. So I feel very strongly about that, and I think that has helped a lot to give me pleasure in what I did, but also to help the library be respected and appreciated. So,
well, it sounds like the law firm world benefited, to be frank, from a lot of the input that you were able to provide for both your employer firms, and also through them, word of mouth, others would try it as well, I'm sure, in other places.
I hope so. I do really, I've always felt, and I've been lucky, because I know there are times and places and folks that have not felt that their efforts have been appreciated, but both of the firms that I've worked with, I found to be appreciative of my efforts. And that's not to say that I got everything that I wanted and that all the recommendations or suggestions or ideas that I had were warmly received, but I always felt that I was listened to. And my bosses may have chosen to go in a different direction, but they heard me out, and I appreciated that.
Well, that's a reasonable way to make decisions.
Yeah.
I mean, they have to look at other things,
that's
perhaps,
right.
But if you get a hearing, you make your case. That's I think what's important.
Yeah, that, and then the other thing of learning that if you got turned down once, that didn't necessarily mean it was the end of what it was. I found, as many people have learned probably, it's nice to sort of plant that seed in somebody's mind, and they may say no initially, but if it's there and they hear from somebody else, or one of their colleagues at another firm is doing something, they might say, oh, she mentioned that, and then they're going to come back and say, well, what about that thing you raised? Or I might feel so strongly about it that I let it simmer with them for a while, and then go back, maybe taking a slightly different tack, and say, well, maybe we should try this, or what do you think of this? Can we talk about this again? So I think one of the messages I'd like to give is just don't give up. If you don't get what you're asking for, you believe in the first time out, keep trying. There are other ways, and as time changes and landscapes change, there's more of a chance. So.
Well, that's usually the case. But speaking of changes in landscape, or however you want to phrase it, you did something that's not too common. You had a distinguished career as a private law firm librarian in several places, But then, after retiring from that, you pop up at Hofstra for an academic year and a bit
Yeah.
more as interim director. And also, to add to your resume at this point, you've also taught law librarianship students here at the University of Washington
That's right.
in Seattle, where we are
That's right,
today.
I'd forgotten about that.
You taught for Penny Hazelton's
I did.
program in law librarianship. Could we talk a little bit about your academic pedigree now that you have as a professor and as a director or associate dean for library and technology or whatever?
Let's talk about the visiting professor position first, which
All right.
was, I've always, I guess I like to challenge myself, and I would like to make a little aside here in that one of the reasons I agreed to run for president of the association when I was asked was because I had two deep fears. One was of flying. For some reason, I was terrified to fly. I had flown a couple times. I never really had a bad experience, but all of a sudden, I just was terrified. I could look at a picture of an airplane in a magazine and my palms would start to sweat. But I love to travel. I like to see different things. So I had that problem. And I also had a deep, deep fear of public speaking. I hated it, as probably most people do. And I thought, well, if I accept the presidency, and if by chance I win, I'm going to have to fly and I'm going to have to speak in public, and it's going to make me get over those fears. And so I accepted that. I also had a terrible fear of going into academia and teaching because I didn't know the first thing about a law school. I'd never been to law school, and so it just, and the thought that I could be teaching, I was really terrified about it. But I had the benefit of a lot of good colleagues who gave me suggestions, and I had some syllabuses from classes folks had taught. And when I got in and met the students and realized what path they were on and what I had to contribute to that, I felt so honored, and I really lost my fear because many of my classes became more like dialogues. We had, they had readings and we had things we were going to discuss and get through, and I had an outline, but a lot of it was just exchanging perspective because they had experiences and I had experiences, and we talked about it, and I thoroughly enjoyed it and just really felt very honored to be able to do that, and felt that it was a very it's a great experience. So I guess I'm very proud of the fact that I actually accepted to do that. And then the Hofstra thing came along. It was very similar to that. I was like, oh my God, I can't do this. It's just so outside of my realm of experience. But when I went for an interview and chatted and talked to Michelle Wu, who was leaving Hofstra, and that was the position that was open, it so much sounded similar. And when I got there, that was really what I found. A lot of the same issues, different room, but a lot of the same things in terms of egos and politics, and then just the basic library business that needs to take place. So all of that was really very similar, and I enjoyed, figuring around how to deal with it. And then the other things just was the technology side of it too. I never have thought of myself as a person who knew a lot about technology, but I had absorbed an awful lot in working with these things. As I said, with records and conflicts, I'd learned those databases and how to put them together. And so when I got to Hofstra, I really found that I knew quite a bit, and I had a wonderful director of technology that I was working with. But I felt like I really had something to give there too, because I had the experience and the passion for the students. And law schools don't always put as much emphasis on that as perhaps they should. The professors are the ones that get a lot of the attention, and the students, in terms of getting out, especially of getting out, they get the knowledge, but it hasn't been until very recently that this sort of learning how to practice comes into play in law schools, and that was something that I worked on quite a bit. And I had wonderful librarians at Hofstra who were also committed in that way and did a great job with the students and helped them develop, but I enjoyed that very much.
In a sense, you have now, by this experience plus your prior experience, validated sort of the assumption that you and I and others had that we were really all in the same profession.
That's right. We
and
are.
had a lot more in common than we might some of us believe.
Exactly. And I don't know where you're going to go with your questions, but I think it's important to bring out that one of the things that when I became president of AALL, I was the first private firm librarian in about 20 years, and that was the time when when I came on, private firms were starting to grow and develop and become a larger group within the association. I sort of went in feeling that my constituency was the private librarians, because there had been sort of a groundswell that if the private firms didn't get more respect, they were going to pull out of AALL and go with SLA or start their own group or whatever. And so I was sort of going to go in there and say, you know, here, we're the privates and we're here to stay and please respect us. But when I got in and started working with people, I realized that that was such the wrong tack to take, that we needed to stay within AALL because we were with people that we had more in common with than anybody else. And we had a lot to learn. Privates have a lot to learn from academics and the government librarians, but it goes the other way as well. And that's where I think we've developed and where we've come to is that respect and understanding and sharing, which is so important.
Well, that sort of begins to perhaps we can sort of move along a little bit and start talking about some of the service that you have given. I mean, you were the first of 3 private firm AALL presidents, all very excellent presidents, as far as, you know, I and my colleagues really thought, both at the time and the years since, but unfortunately not followed by any other private firm librarians that have been elected AALL president. But maybe that will change, and it's not for lack of running. There have been a number of good candidates, but they just haven't been elected. But hopefully, you know, you won't be the last 3. You weren't the first.
Definitely, I'm sure we will not be the last 3. There will be more, but it's difficult. As you said, I was very lucky to have a firm like Shaw Pittman that was so supportive of my efforts. I've always felt that the firms really don't get a whole lot out of it in academia. It's all tied up with you know what you're trying to do and how you progress in the profession. Whereas in the private firms, they really don't care. They want the book on their desk with the information they need, and what you do with the rest of it, there's just no benefit for them. But I really did work to explain to my firm that especially on the local level in DC, that my being involved in LSDC meant that I could get the information they needed. The obscure thing that nobody else had but one firm in town, I could get it for them because I was involved in that, and they saw that and then just became more and more supportive of it. But
well, you did a lot in the local society, as we call our chapter. You were president twice of the Law Librarian Society of Washington, D.C. I think the second time there were I don't remember all the circumstances, but I think in some ways you came to the rescue. Yeah,
I think that there was a little bit of a hiatus in the commitment to the society at that point, and I just cared enough about it and really did feel it was so important to myself and to Washington, to the librarians there, that it not flounder. So I did get involved in it again, and I don't think I performed any miracles, but I kept it on track, and
it seems quite viable today.
Yeah, they seem very viable and doing real well. So.
Well, you also, for AALL, you were on the executive board first. In fact, you and I had the dubious honor, I think people around the country thought something odd was up, because we were both from Washington, D.C., running the same year, and we were the 2 of the 4 candidates who were elected.
Yeah. And well, it does somewhat speak to the numbers of the Washington, D.C. chapter, Pat.
Well, in those days, they not only were numerous, about 10% of the total number of law librarians in AALL, but they also were very active, and they voted for the hometown folks. And it wasn't just the 2 of us. I mean, you can see this over the years. Many very good colleagues from DC have gone on to national office. And but you did that, and you and I, in fact, were on the board together. But then some years later, you were elected president of AALL, and then you asked me to be your program chair for your annual meeting, and that was a wonderful experience for me, and I hope not a bad one for you.
Yeah, oh no, it was wonderful.
Would you like to talk a little bit about some of those things?
Well, I'd like to first talk about when you mentioned that was that you talked about our meetings with Cami King Hedges, and I really looked at you two as my kitchen cabinet, because you had the experience certainly on the academic side, and Cami had her BNA, but also other experiences. She'd worked in all different kinds of libraries, and that was just a tremendous help to me and gave me the confidence to do what I needed. But working with you on the program committee and with the idea again of making sure that the programs were useful to all different types of libraries. I think there was a lot of resentment when I came on, because the privates we were going to the meetings, but we had to take the scraps that the academics threw out. You know, if you were talking about an integrated library system, we'd have to figure out, well, you know, their scale and their budget is so much larger than ours. What does this really mean to us? And we worked, I know, with the programs to be sure that there was very solid representation, substantive representation of the different types of libraries, so you didn't have to work quite that hard to see how it applied to your particular setting. So I think
one of the advantages that I had certainly as program chair, was an awful lot of rooms available in which to schedule programs.
Right. We did put on more.
And we put on more programs than I think had ever been the case before. And I remember some of the concerns raised were that, you know, I couldn't go to everything.
Right.
Well, they were being recorded and get them that way. But and some of them were a little controversial. I mean, we needed to, for example, many of our members, including many of the librarians, both from all types of libraries, are lawyers in states where they have to have a certain amount of continuing education credits. Well, we got certification, but not for, say, a program on normal cataloging or something that more germane to our librarians' hats. But we had to have substantive things that would appeal to the bar exam or the bar association for giving them credits, and so we scheduled some of those, and a lot of those had been proposed by the social concerns group, and they were a tiny bit controversial in topics, but they satisfied those needs, and so we scheduled a lot of those as well, and I think it was a wonderful experience for me. I enjoyed it immensely.
No, it was
I hope you didn't take too much flack.
Not at all, Pat, not at all.
Yeah.
Everyone, you know, I think considered it a very successful meeting, and I certainly was happy to have those sort of sometimes smaller, perhaps not as broadly based programs, but that filled a need for certain people, and I think that was, you know, one of the things I was very happy about with the program.
Well, one of the ways that we developed those programs, and we threw out an invitation to every member of the association to come forth with proposals for programs. And one of the things we were able to achieve was, I think every proposal was okay. They were good, and we were able, with all those rooms, to let every proposal somehow end up in the final
somewhere,
mix.
whether it was
Even if I sort of combined and talked the proponents of several of them to kind of come together, and we did it that way. But
I think that reminded me of something that I think is important too, which was at that time the private librarians were often, as I sort of implied, sort of grousing about our position within the association, and one of the messages that I wanted to send out was, if you're unhappy about it, you can do something about it. You've got to become active. You've got to propose programs. And I believe for that meeting we had many more programs from the private firm group than had been in the past, because I just wanted to get the message out that if you're going to complain about something, you got to take action. Otherwise, I don't want to hear your complaints. You've got to be willing to work towards the solution.
And I was sufficiently sensitive to both that concern that, you know, groups felt disenfranchised, and the fact that, you know, we needed to empower people by putting these things on if possible. So we were able to present all of those.
And one of the things I remember when I was working in LSDC, probably as during my first presidency, was that was right when the special interest sections had been established in AA-LL. I don't remember what year that was, but then we were just putting them in on the local level, for the Law Librarian Society of DC, and that was something again that was very interesting to me of really breaking out the profession by the types of libraries, but also under the broader umbrella. And I think there are, some people think that the SISs have always been there, and they certainly haven't. They're dynamic, really.
No, they were a very substantial and controversial change. In fact, I was president of the Law Librarian Society when we first created SISs within the society, and I know many of us were worried that it would either really help the society and help it grow, which is what happened.
Right.
Or it would be the demise of the society. Everything would fragment, and no one would be communicating with anybody except within their own little group.
With their own type, yeah.
And that fortunately did not
happen.
Yeah, that was good. Well, as I've already mentioned early on, you have been recognized for all that you've done for the profession with the Marion Gould Gallagher Distinguished Service Award and the membership in our AELL Hall of Fame. Before we sort of move along a little bit, is there anything more about your professional involvement that you would like to mention?
No, I think we've pretty much covered it. I think we've covered it. It just the other thing I guess I would just add to all of that is that whatever I've put in, both professionally in my jobs and professionally for the associations, I really feel like I've gotten back much more than I put into it, really. And it's as much work as it is, it's never really seemed like work.
Mm-hmm. Well, in a sense, I think you've kind of put a nice wrap onto the end of our conversation, but in case there is anything else you want to mention before we end, I'll give you that opportunity. This is sort of my custom with these conversations, these interviews.
No, I guess the only thing I would say was that I'm very humbled by receiving the Marion Gould Gallagher Award, something that I had never even thought about, to be quite honest with you. It just never crossed my radar. So of course I'm honored and humbled by that, and it's an occasion for me to really reflect back on all of the people that I've worked with in the, I guess, 30-some years that I have been in this profession, and how much I have gotten from them and what it has meant to me, and I'm very grateful for that as well. So, and I'm grateful to the profession, which I love, obviously.
Thank you for talking with me this morning, and also for all of these many years of our friendship and all the things you've done for my profession, which is our profession, and all the other things, Carolyn. It's been wonderful, and thank you for being here this morning.
Thank you very much, Pat. I've enjoyed it.